Hey folks, Yousef here with Impact Soundworks, and today I'm going to be showing you how I composed a film-style action cue using Momentum, a rhythmic sound design collection featuring all organic and acoustic materials. Today we'll be going over its UI, its various sound shaping tools, its various instruments and performances, and of course, we'll be looking at how Momentum, true to its name, can be the engine that drives your track forward. But before we get a bit too ahead of ourselves, let's listen to the track. Now, a huge amount of sounds were performed and recorded to create this library. We not only have traditional instruments, but also a lot of found objects, like computer keyboards and drawing machines. Even when a patch does use traditional instruments, it probably features a creative approach to playing it, like hitting a violin string with mallets, or playing an erhu with a guitar pick. There's an exhaustive list of unquantized and organic performances here, and they all feature unique sounds you probably won't find anywhere else. Before we get into more detail about this track, let's briefly take a look at Momentum. Momentum exists in 3 separate NKIs. This is the main one. At the top of the UI is the name of the performance we have loaded. Click on the patch title to view the library. Here, you can search based on a handful of parameters. In the middle of the screen, we have the loop's waveform, with each hit point mapped to the purple and blue keys at the bottom of the screen. The purple key plays the loop from the beginning. Each subsequent hit point is mapped to the blue keys in the order they appear. Lastly, the magenta-colored keys are one-shots. And as you can expect, penciling this in our piano roll is a breeze. That loop ends a bit abruptly. Let's finish it off with a one-shot so it sounds a bit more natural. That sounds better. Now, some of these performances are unpitched percussion, but others have an audible pitch. The tonal loop we're using here is on E. Now that's going to clash with my track in C minor, so I'm going to shift this note down from E to C using the pitch key switches. You can find them between the -2 and -1 range. Okay, so let's get to the arrangement. Back when I was in college, I had this professor named Mark Simos, who had this theory called 360-degree songwriting. Now, his idea is that anything, be it a bass line, a chord progression, a few words, even a song form, anything could be the seed that becomes a song. The reason I'm mentioning this is because when I first started using Momentum, I found its performances really inspiring and easy to build on top of, which is great if you're going into a project blind, like I was with this. This whole track was actually built around this single loop. I decided to use this loop as the rhythmic motif for the whole song. I started by making a low string ostinato that uses the exact same rhythm. The idea here is for the strings and the first instance of momentum to trade with each other using call and response. But it was at this point I realized that it might get a bit boring if I had momentum simply looping the same rhythm over and over again. Not to worry, momentum has us covered. You'll see in Kontakt there are multiples of variations on this exact patch. This allows you to string performances together to provide longer lines, or in this case, do some motivic development. And that's what the second track is doing. Now the third track is doing yet another variation, only with this one, I played with the rhythm a little by messing with when the loop is re-engaged. Then, in order to fill in some of the gaps, I threw in some low epic percussion, just to add some sense of weight and grandeur. And doubling those hits is our ever-handy Mega Brass library playing staccato. Towards the end, as the energy gets bigger and more chaotic, I added in some brass hits. Now, these three instruments combined are providing that large orchestral sound while also filling in the lower frequencies for us. This transition here is a short swell being performed by a handful of instruments. We have some reverse piano, a synth doing a riser, some brass, and I did a little bit of sound design here, absolutely demolishing a low taiko hit and tuning it to the root of the chord. It doesn't really sound like a taiko at all anymore, actually, and for this I used our Kageyama taiko instrument. Okay, so this next section is really all about these two momentum tracks here, tracks 4 and 5. Let's take a quick listen to 4. So that's clearly two separate loops, but I have them on the same track. Let's open up Kontakt to see how I'm doing that. So this is the second NKI, and it's called the Momentum Loop Mapper. As you can see, I'm using the bass drum cymbal patch, which is actually a multi-performance. This UI lets you map a bunch of loops to the keyboard. This means you can cycle between different performances of the same instrument, which is what I did here. To map loops to the keyboard, just click on one of the blacked out keys, go to the library, and then click on the performance you want. And it's done. Now, keep in mind, you do lose one-shots when you're in this mode. So if those are absolutely essential for you, you'll need to open up each loop in its own separate instance, which is actually exactly what I did at the beginning of the song with the first 3 tracks. Now, remember how I said the first track would act as the rhythmic motif for the whole song? Well, that rhythm makes another appearance here in our 5th track. I'm using the patch China Cymbal 1 in combination with the delay plugin. Both tracks have had their cut knobs, found here on Kontakt, turned down to around 1.6K for a bit of high cut. Now, as these were going to be looped for 8 bars, I felt I needed something new to keep the energy going at about the halfway mark. That's where track 8 comes in. I decided to use a single hit from a patch called Prayer Bowl Mallets. This patch is part of the one-shots NKI, which is really handy. One-shots are mapped, mostly chromatically, across the keyboard. And so that gave us this. Everything else I'm doing here is really just low percussion. At the end of this section, the violins do a tremolo crescendo, referencing the crescendo the brass had done way back over here. This is layered with the same reverse piano sample. Now, as you remember from when I first played the track, this next section of the song is really about to blow up. But first, before that moment, I wanted to create a little bit of tension so that when it finally drops, it's all the more satisfying. I started by adding the muted bass drum stand 1 patch. If we listen, you'll hear there's this click-like sound overlaid on the bass. It's nice, but I just wanted the bass. So again, I turned down the cut knob to about 384, and that gave us this. Next, I used a trigger effect right before the drop. If we look at the Kontakt keyboard, you'll see there's these red keys over here. Those are trigger effects. E-flat gives us a 30-second note stutter. Let's see what that sounds like now with the cut knob turned down and the stutter effect at the end. Track 7 is using the napkin holder 3 patch, and yes, this is a loop of somebody performing a napkin holder. And I've added the reverse trigger effect, as well as the same stutter effect I used on track 8. I've also added some volume automation in my DAW to swell it in. This next section is definitely my favorite. The low hits and the kick drum are doing something almost like a metal breakdown. Mega Brass, in combination with another low brass plugin, are bursting with these long, powerful sustains. I've warped the sound of a taiko drum yet again, this time with its upper registers, making it sound like something you might find in the Doom soundtrack. Sounds more like a synth now, and it's quite cinematic. And down here we have the synth playing arpeggios, but with the glide knob turned up so high it just ends up confusing the synth, making it slide up and down without any tonal center. Now, the snare drum here is interesting because it's actually a patch called Atonal One Shots 2 from the One Shot NKI. What's special about this sound is that I manipulated it into sounding like a snare. If I turn off the effects, it kind of sounds like what is that? Maybe like a metal sheet or something? But by adding some low-end harmonics with Renaissance bass, extra attack and sustain using Transient Master, doubling and detuning using Microshift, distortion using Supercharger GT, reverb, and shaping the EQ into something resembling a snare drum, it became a snare drum. Superfluous? Maybe. But it was definitely fun. So for this current section that we're in, I decided that I wanted to stack a bunch of momentum tracks on top of each other as a way of showing you just how well they layer. So I started with tracks 9 and 10. Both of these are still following that main rhythmic motif I established at the beginning, but the performances are stressing different beats. 9 is using the ironing 3 patch, which I can only assume is someone playing an ironing board. Kind of makes you wish you could have been there when they were recording these. Anyway, that's layered with tracks 10, which is using the China Cymbal 1 patch, and together they sound like this. After that, track 11 is performing the Gong Brush patch, which is a super funky rhythm. And track 12 uses the Hand Dread patch, which sounds like this dry, but with the effects I've added, sounds like this. If we head over to Kontakt and navigate to the Effects tab, here, we'll find a bunch of rack effects which are super helpful in shaping our loops. I used a mix of Transient Designer for punch, plus Scream and Bit Crusher for distortion and crunchiness, finishing with a touch of delay. Altogether, these 4 tracks sound like this. Notice how to make room for tracks 9 through 12. Tracks 4 and 5 dip out. As for the ending, I brought back almost everything from the intro, but then added the kick drum and track 12, just to feel like it has some connection to the previous section. This also adds an extra element of drive. Now, in terms of the mix, I didn't do a whole lot, and that's because the sections aren't overly dense, and the instruments I chose are more or less complementary in terms of their frequency response. So it really came down to setting great levels and then automating and writing what needed to be automated. That said, let's take a look at the mixer view and see what I threw in there. On the third instance of Momentum, I'm using Soothe 2 to get rid of some of the attack, as I found it clashed a bit with the other instruments. Track 5 also features some in-UI cut, but I also added a stereo delay plugin so that it sustains over the parts it's not on. Both of those tracks have some in-DAW low cut as well. 6.2 features some in-contact filter cut, and track 7 is completely dry. Both of those tracks feature trigger effects though, which, had they not been available in UI, I would have had to use other plugins, so that's really helpful. Track 12 features heavy use of the effects racks within Momentum, which I already showed. Tracks 9 through 12 also feature some low cut in Cubase. Track 13 is that snare I created. I already went over what I did there, so I'll just show you the settings for each plugin. And every Momentum track, except for the snare, is being sent to a group track with Soothe 2 taking away a bit of harshness, and Spaces adding a little bit of reverb. Despite the strings being spiccato, I found they didn't have enough bite, so I added attack using one of my favorite plugins, Transient Master. Those were being sent to a group track with Soothe 2 cleaning up some mud. And then, for some convolution reverb, we're using Spaces again. That distorted taiko, synth-like sound during the drop is being accomplished using Driver's Beast and Bass preset. All of the brass are also basically as is, and they're being sent to a group track with the same Soothe 2 preset as the strings. There's yet another heavily distorted taiko hit I warped into being sound effects. I already talked about how I did this one, so I'll just show you the settings. The Rise synth and the piano are as is, and the reverse piano sample I made has a bit of low cut. That really dirty sliding synth also has some low cut, as well as some reverb on it. Its reverb is coming from Relab Development's LX480. The kick and the snare I created are both going to their own group track, which is sending itself to a sidechain multiband compressor on the mix bus. I'm using Wave's C6 plugin, and as you can see, I have it set to dip down in the low frequencies when the kick is engaged. Everything except for the kick and the snare, obviously, is being sent to the mix bus, which means that every time the kick occurs, this plugin creates space for it to properly sit in the mix. Now, the best way to do this is to cut at the kick's fundamental. Lastly, my mix bus features an SSL bus compressor, which at most is compressing 4 dB. And that's the track. As you'll come to find out, Momentum is pretty user-friendly and easy to use, but the depth is there if you want it. In fact, there are a handful of sound design features I didn't even get the chance to talk about today, which is why I strongly recommend checking out our in-depth walkthrough linked below. And of course, for everything else Impact Soundworks, you know where to go, www.impactsoundworks.com. That's it for me. I'll catch you all next time. Once again, my name is Yousef. Have a good one.